Jade is the brand new support Warframe, and she supports the team by, I mean, if there are no enemies left, then they can't hurt you, right? So yeah, today we're gonna go over everything you need to know about Jade, her skills, where to get her, how to mod her, both the budget version and an expensive one, and of course, I'm gonna show you how to reproduce this beauty of a build. As always, big shoutouts to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. First of all, how can you get your own greedy fingers on Jade? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. First of all, you need to have the new war quest finished, otherwise you won't have access to the follow-up quest. This follow-up quest being Jade Shadows, which came with the update, and don't worry, I'm not going to spoil anything. And finishing this quest will reward you the Jade Blueprint, and then afterwards you gain access to the new Ascension game mode on Uranus, where you can get the component blueprints as drops. Alternatively, you can also go to the Laronda Relay and talk to Ordis there, where you can buy the main blueprint as well as the component blueprints for a new resource called Vestigial Modes, which you will get by playing the new Ascension game mode. That is pretty much all you need to know about her acquisition. But now that you have her, what can she actually do? Let's take a look at her skills. First off, her passive is really interesting because she is the only current Warframe in the game that has access to 2 aura mod slots. So you can slot in 2 auras of your choice, one of them being a universal polarity, so you have a lot of options here. And yes, 2 aura slots also means twice the bonus in mod capacity, so you should get away with a decent build here even without making yourself poor on Forma. Her first ability is called Light's Judgement, and this one is pretty cool. You throw out a sort of light grenade that creates an AoE on impact. Enemies in that AoE take a little bit of damage over time, and also they get those little green markers over their head. What these markers do is they make enemies 50% more vulnerable to damage. Think of it as kind of something like a viral proc. Also, if you or allies enter this AoE, you get healed over time, and even after leaving the AoE, the heal will stay with you for a couple of seconds. In that sense, it's kinda similar to the Wisp modes. Jade's 2, Symphony of Mercy. This one is amazing because you can cycle through 3 powerful buffs. The first one gives you more ability strength, the second one gives you more weapon damage, and even though the wiki isn't updated on that yet, I personally think it's a base damage buff, and the fourth one gives you massive shield recharge that also translates into overshields. Now, one thing I need to say about the shield part here is that the regeneration doesn't constantly go on. Whenever you take damage, the regeneration of the shields will be paused for a fraction of a second. So unfortunately, you can't roleplay as an Aros, sit in the middle of 1,000 enemies and hope that your regeneration will outpace the incoming damage. That's not gonna happen. Also, one very important thing to mention here, and that goes regarding the ability strength buff, is if you cast other abilities, they snapshot the higher ability strength that you have if the ability strength buff is on. What that means is, if you cast another ability under the effects of the ability strength buff, and then you swap the buff out to something else, then the other ability will still continuously benefit from the previously higher ability strength. Jade's third ability goes by the name Ophanim Eyes, or as I like to call it, Green Flashlight. What this does is it creates a green cone of light in front of you, and enemies within that cone of light get massively slowed, and continuously over time, both their shields and armor are gonna tick down until they eventually reach 0. Also, you deal a little bit of heat damage, but I don't think that's worth mentioning. And if you turn that cone of light towards a downed ally, you can actually revive them just by looking at them. This ability is also her Helmet ability, so you can use it on other Warframes, albeit that the revive feature will be cut on the Helmet version, but I personally think we don't really mind about that. And finally, we have her big bada boom ultimate called Glory of High. If you press the button, Jade jumps into the air and can be controlled kind of like Titania, up, down, left, right, and into all directions. One thing I should mention here that this state is an exalted weapon that you can mod individually. We're gonna take a look at it in more detail here in a second. But what it boils down to is, with the normal fire, you shoot out lasers that deal a bit of an AoE on impact. That is so far nothing special. However, what is nice is that with every hit that you deal with them, you have a fixed 10% chance of adding one of these green icons over the enemy's heads that debuffs them. Remember the thing that the first ability could do. However, the way we really deal damage with this is by using the Alt Fire. What the Alt Fire does is it creates a big explosion on all enemies that have those green markers over their head. This makes her first ability extremely potent because you can just throw it into a group of enemies and then instantly trigger the nuke with her 4. And what makes it even better is, the closer enemies are together when you nuke them, the more damage each and every individual explosion does. So grouping enemies up is definitely something you want to do if you go for the ultimate here. I know this was a lot already, but there is one more thing, and that is if you annihilate enemies that have the green marker over the head with your 4th ability, you regain a bit of duration on your 2nd skill, so ideally you don't have to recast that ever. And as always, if you could drop a like on the video, that would be absolute sugar, and I would love you for that because it helps big time with the YouTube algorithm. So cheers so much for your support. So much about her skills. Let's now take a closer look for a moment at her exalted weapon called Glory. When we're looking at the stats, this one actually doesn't look all too amazing. The fire rate is absolutely abysmal with only 1.67 shots per second, but that's also not too big of a problem because ideally we don't want to use the normal fire all too much anyway and nuke away at the enemies right away. The crit chance is relatively low, coming in at only 15%, status chance is okay, and the heat damage is actually pretty decent. Now, when it comes to how to mod this one, I actually have 3 options for you. The first one is especially good on higher level enemies where you want to go for damage over time and faction damage to double dip to deal even more damage. Here we go for pure heat, more status chance, and a mixture of crit and multi-shot. The reason I mod into crit here, even though the crit chance is not all too great, is because I will use Arcane Avenger later on the build, so that together with Prime Pistol Gambit and Arcane Avenger, we can get the exalted weapon to a total of 90-ish% crit chance. The next build though, and I personally think this one is absolutely fun and amazing, is a gas-focused build. Remember the gas status chance, creating a gas cloud that deals damage over time to all the enemies that come into it? Well, if we nuke away all the enemies all the time, and they get pulled into the gas clouds that creates, then this is going to create a chain reaction of destruction. You're also going to see that later in the gameplay, and I personally find this to be extremely fun. And finally, this right here would be my budget option for a build, is still pretty good, albeit not that good as the previous 2 ones. Okay. Now, before we jump into the Jade build herself, let's first take a look at how to actually play her in practice so you know what we need to focus on with the build. See, when it comes to Jade, you basically have 2 main playstyle options. One will be the ultimate focus build where you want to deal as much damage with your 4th ability, and the other one is ignoring your 4th ability and just using all the buffs in your toolkit to be an amazing weapons platform. Regardless of which approach you choose, one thing you always want to do is throw your 1 around as much as you can because you want to weaken those enemies. Then, if you want to go for the ult build, then you should try to be in your ultimate form as much as you can to deal more damage. As for the weapon platform version, you ideally want to have your 3 on all the time because this is actually a huge layer of protection for you since it slows enemies down all that much, and of course, it also reduces their defenses. By the way, if you play for the ultimate, you could also have this one on all the time, but in my personal testing, it kind of felt like it's not that necessary here, and if you wanted to go for a helmet ability on the ultimate build, then in my opinion, replacing the 3rd would be the best option. And last, but definitely not least, you of course also want to have your 2nd skill up all the time because that gives you so many buffs. And here the approach is actually relatively straightforward in that mostly you want to have your weapon damage buff up all the time, but if your shields happen to go low, then you better take some cover for a second, switch to the shield buffs to quickly recharge them and then peek out again. And whenever you want to recast an ability that scales with strength, quickly switch over to the ability strength buff to snapshot more strength into that ability before going back to your weapon damage bonus. But alright, so much about the skills and the gameplay, let's now look at builds, starting out with Jade's budget approach. This one should be absolutely no problem to put together for everyone who can realistically farm her in-game. In the auras, we first use Pistol Amp because her exalted weapon is a secondary weapon, as well as Aerodynamic to reduce the damage taken while we're in the air, which comes in really handy when you're in your ultimate state all the time. This is, by the way, also why I put Aviator in the Excellence slot, because that gives us even more damage reduction, as well as Adaptation to add even more damage reduction on top of that. Aerodynamic, Adaptation, and Aviator. That's what AAA gaming looks like. As for the rest of the build, we have a healthy mix of ability strength, range, and duration. Strength comes in with Umbral Intensify, Duration with Continuity, Range with Stretch and Augur Reach, and because of the fact that her ultimate drains quite some energy and takes even more energy whenever you do the alt fire, Streamline should be a very clever choice here. Also Equilibrium to regain all the energy that we're burning, and finally Redirection because, we recharge our shields, so having more shields is more betterer. This right here would be the full build, and as you also see in the background, it already is quite potent in Steel Path. But now, with the budget build out of the way, let's take a look at the high investment build that absolutely nukes the living heck out of those enemies. So, when it comes to the high investment build that I crafted, the first thing we need to take a look at is the Archon shards, because otherwise we're not going to understand how the build exactly works. And as shards, I went for 2 blue ones that gives me more maximum energy, because that way we don't have to use a flow mod, saving up 1 mod slot. And in the other 3 slots, I went for the purple Archon shards, giving me a fraction of the equilibrium effect, because equilibrium will be the source of our energy income, and this way we don't even have to take equilibrium itself, freeing up another mod slot for the build. As for helmet abilities, with Jade, as I previously said, you don't really need any if you don't want to, but just for the fun of it, I went for Roar and replaced her 3rd ability with it because I found that having that more consistent damage is a bit better than having to wait until the enemy defenses are ticking down all the time. But which helmet abilities would you like to use on her? Let me know in the comments down below, would be really interesting to hear that. As for the Jade build itself, first of all, growing power in the aura to give us more ability strength, and then, as with the budget build, aerodynamic, aviator, and adaptation for the survivability, giving us a lot of damage reduction, plus primed redirection to enhance our shields. Then, ability strength will come from Umbral Intensify and Transient Fortitude, duration from primed continuity, reach from Augur Reach and Stretch, which is actually important because you want to have a bit more range on your first ability, dealing more weakness to the enemies in that AoE. And finally, also here, I went for Streamline to give me more efficiency because if you nuke away with her 4th skill all the time, that burns so much energy, we can't really afford to go for Blind Rage or anything else here. Let's also take a look at the Arcanes, where, as I already teased in the weapon overview, we use Arcane Avenger, giving us a flat plus 45% crit chance, bringing her Exalted weapon to almost 100% crit chance, so that's nice. And the second Arcane slot is kind of a flex choice. We don't need Arcane Energize here because we have the energy income from the purple shards, or Equilibrium if you wanted to go for the budget build. So I personally would recommend something that increases the damage for secondary weapons, so her ultimate deals more damage, which is why I went for Arcane Precision, giving us plus 300% damage to secondary weapons after scoring a headshot. But you could of course also go and take the one that gives you more fire rate for secondary weapons, or anything else here. This was the Warframe build, but we are by far not done now because this setup has much more to it. First off, I want to direct your attention to a very special melee weapon, that being the Furex or the Furex Wraith. Because there is a special amalgam mod called Amalgam Furex Wraith Body Count, which makes it that if you have the Furex or the Furex Wraith in your loadout, you don't need to use it, just needs to be there, and you equip that mod onto it, then secondary weapons in your arsenal, including Jade's ultimate, will get more fire rate. Given the fact that you're probably not going to use a melee weapon on Jade anyway, this is a nice buff that I would recommend. Next, and this is also very important, let's take a look at her companion options because they do make a meaningful difference. And when it comes to companions, my personal first choice would be Nautilus because, as we all know, Nautilus has the skill Cordon, which groups up enemies for you, and given that, the nuke from her ultimate deals more damage if enemies are grouped tightly together, this is a definite win. As for the build, the only things that are really important here are, of course, Cordon, so Nautilus can group up the enemies, but also Guardian because, as we all know, Guardian refreshes your shields back to full if they ever go down to 0, so that comes in very handy. Manifold Bond to drastically reduce the cooldown on all of those companion skills, and, also very important, Duplex Bond because we're going to use a nice little trick here to deal even more damage and at the same time keep the enemy from doing any damage to us. See, what Duplex Bond does is, whenever you use 100 energy, your companion will create a clone of itself, and that clone then goes and attacks enemies. You can have up to 3 clones on the field at any given time. Now, the reason we need those clones is that we're going to equip our Nautilus with the Verglass weapon, which is a cryo beam weapon with high fire rate and high status chance, so that not only our main Nautilus, but also their 3 clones can constantly freeze enemies. And looking at the Verglass build, we're gonna go of course for more fire rate and status chance, but also, very important, the mod Shivering Contagion, which makes that whenever you deal a cold status effect to an enemy, you have a chance to spread that cold status effect to more nearby enemies, basically perma-freezing all the foes around you. This is really potent, not only because frozen enemies cannot hurt you, but also because you deal enhanced crit damage against enemies affected by cold, and with this update, when enemies are fully frozen, that additional crit damage is even twice as strong. So if you ask me, Nautilus to group up the enemies and then with the Verglass to freeze them all is the best choice for a companion when you're playing Jade. But don't click away just yet, video ain't over. Remember how in the gameplay section I said that Jade basically has 2 playstyles? Well, so far we only talked about her ultimate playstyle, so I also prepared a build for you that focuses on the weapon platform. What we do here is mainly focus on a lot of ability strength as well as duration to get tons and tons of effects out of her buffs from her secondary ability as well as defense reduction from her third. So Growing Power, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Augur Secrets, and Umbrella Intensify all to massively buff up our ability strength. Then Prime Continuity and Augur Message for the duration, Stretch for a bit of range on her first ability, and since we're going to be more on the ground with this one, I went for Primed Sure-Footed in the Exilus slot so we can't get knocked down, and this one right here would be the full build. This is definitely also fun, especially when you want to deal a lot of damage with your weapons, but if you ask me, the flying around nuking everything playstyle is my personal #1 choice. And if you now want to deal way more damage in general, then definitely don't miss this guide right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtle Pier, Pepperwolf, Ondakanio2, Misfire DX, Dreamjet21, and all other generous channel members for your continued support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.